Today, calibrating the real impact of household financial relief. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, well, latest post covering finance and property news. Well, today I want to update you on the latest from our models, which of course now are running for July. That's the first month that the new tax bands have come in. And of course, we also have had the various levels of government support, both state and federal, to try and help people out. The official narrative, of course, is that all of this financial relief will make a big impact. So the question I want to explore today is, well, how much impact did it make and who benefited? And just before I start, let me say that last month, my show, More Household Trouble in the Land of Oz, was one of the most viewed shows ever on the channel. And this is where I went into the detail of the analysis from our surveys and also highlighted which postcodes and which households were actually in the most difficulty. And while I'm talking about what's happened recently, it's worth just highlighting that once again, the banks are still pushing for tweaks to the responsible lending rules to allow them to lend even more. ANZ boss says the de-risking of Australia's very safe banking system is coming at a cost to growth and economic dynamism. A rebalancing is required. In other words, I want to lend you more. And yet APRA has confirmed that they are not going to change the bank's mortgage rate buffer. It's still going to stay at 3%. And in fact, in the recent commentary, they said, given the uncertain economic and interest rate outlook, including the possibility of higher cost of living pressures, it's important that prudent buffers are incorporated into serviceability assessments. The mortgage serviceability buffer at 3 percentage points forces banks to assess customers on an ability to repay borrowings at an annual rate of about 10%, given where home loans are currently priced. And in response, of course, the banks came out and said, well, what we should do is offer then 50-year mortgages because that'll help. But as Alex Joyner said, this makes housing more affordable, quote unquote, by reducing monthly mortgage payments, but increases the overall cost of home ownership. A bank's dream, but aspiring homeowners' nightmare. This shouldn't be allowed to happen. Affordability is a price issue, not a leverage one. I agree. And in fact, in a following conversation point, so if someone retires at 65, they need to buy a home at 15 just so they don't have to work until they're 80, to which Alex said, that's what the banks want, a commitment for an entire working life. And of course, that's the problem. Mortgage equals debt slavery. And the longer that you pay your mortgage for, the more the bank profits from it. So taking that into account, it's also worth noting this, that Canada has announced a 30-year mortgage starting in 2 days. More debt, of course, there. But interestingly, we've had 30-year mortgages plus here in Australia. And at the moment, one of the little tricks that we're seeing looking at the way that banks are operating is that they are extending the term of mortgages. But of course, what that does is to incur greater interest costs over a longer period of time. And just as another contextual point before we get into detail, this piece of data should send shivers down everybody's spines, because here we can see that household disposable income, in other words, what you've really got based on 2019 onwards, has dropped dramatically in Australia and significantly more so than the G7 countries, the OECD countries, or the US. And there's your problem, of course. A lot of households in Australia highly leveraged and in real terms income going backwards. So no surprise that we see considerable pressures. And just to be clear, it's not just me saying we have an issue. Roy Morgan's latest stress analysis, this is to the end of June, shows that 30.3% of households with owner-occupied mortgages have a problem, and 20% are extremely at risk. And you can see how those trends have risen in the last little while. So with that context, let me now talk about the latest modelling that we've done And just to explain that we've updated our models to take account of the new tax bands that came in from 1 July, and also the impact of the recent support packages, including electricity bill subsidies, and also rent support, and even things like public transport benefit in some areas too. So all of that information, plus the survey data, goes into our core market model, and then we can overlay the data and slice and dice it different sorts of ways, and also have a bit of a view as to what may be happening ahead as well. The model takes mortgage stress data from our surveys, the price history and trajectory of property, and also the buying and selling intentions from the surveys, the migration data, and also the economic data, CPI, wages and employment. All of that goes into the core market model through our scenarios, and then we can look at it at a postcode level and roll it up to a region, state, and or Australia level. Now, this model has been around since 2001, and we've been measuring stress consistently over that period. I would say that the way we define stress is somewhat different from, for example, what Roy Morgan does. And that's because we define stress in cash flow terms, money in, money out. There are many ways to define stress. Some use a fixed 30% of income, or maybe taxable income. Others use measures closer to the underwriting metrics, which is what Roy Morgan does. But we define stress in cash flow terms, which means if households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items and income, we define them as stress. If they have a mortgage, then they're in mortgage stress. If renting, then rental stress. Investors with cash flow pressures are also identified as stressed investors, and we can aggregate the data to estimate total financial stress across all households. And we can express each as a percentage of households in account. As I've often argued, the latter is probably a better measure because it gives you the rule of big numbers. Now, the RBA some time ago did use this little chart to show the spectrum of household financial stress. On the left-hand side, you have budget pressures, which is mild financial stress, but it can grade into missing payments through to insolvency on the right, which is the severe end. But of course, this is not the same as defaults. And as we'll see later, defaults are still relatively low, although rising. Now, I measure financial stress and household stress at the budget pressure level. In other words, where people are having to make severe decisions and trade-offs between what they pay their money away on. They tend, of course, to prioritize mortgages and also rental payments, depending on their situations. So now we can look at the overall story. This is the stress data to the end of July. And the first observation, if you look at the blue line, that's the rental stress. It's actually come back just a little bit, but we've still got 76% of those in the rental sector who are struggling, which means that the support levels that are there for the rental sector are not having a significant impact on those who are renting. Sure, some are getting some relief, but many are not. And at 76.9%, it's still very, very high. Looking at the yellow line, the mortgage stress, you can see there that there is a tick down. Last month, we were over 50%. Now we're at 49.7%. So the changes in the tax bands and also changes to income and potentially also changes to mortgage rates are having some impact, but only minor. And at 49.7%, stress is still a lot higher than it was before COVID. Back in February 2020, it was at 32.9%. And interestingly, the latest data from the RBA to May shows the debt-to-income ratio is 184.7. So you can see that it's still hanging up at quite a high level. And once again, let me emphasize, the trouble with this data point is that it spreads it across all households, not just those who are borrowing. The truth is that many households are still getting mortgages at 5, 6, and 7 times income. So now let's look at the July data. And we'll start with the state-based data. And you can see on this chart, I've highlighted in yellow where it's gone up from last month, and in blue where it's dropped. And the first observation is that mortgage stress overall did drop 49.73%, comparing it with the June data at 50.71%. And interestingly, it dropped in the ACT, New South Wales, South Australia, Tasmania, Western Australia, and an average total, but it rose in the Northern Territories, in Queensland, and in Victoria. Turning to rental stress, you can see there that this month it's 76.97%. That translates to about 2.38 million households in rental stress. If you compare that with June, it was 77.3, with slightly more in stress. So there was a slight move. It's also worth highlighting that across all states, there was a bit of a fall. That, of course, is explained a little bit by some of those support levels that have come in, as well as the electricity support. But I noted a rise in the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory is much more volatile, though, because it's such a small sample. Looking at stressed investors, well, in July, 16.39% were actually stressed, a significant drop from 23.4% just a month ago. So actually, it's investors who are seeing a significant leverage advantage by the moves that have come in this time around. Interestingly, in Tasmania, though, stressed investors rose to 25.66%. That's more than 19,000 stressed investors in Tasmania, but it dropped in all other states. And now looking at the financial stress data, which is all households, we can see there that it dropped as well at 47.89%. That's 4.67 million households out of the 9.76 million that we see in the survey. Last month, it was 50.38%, and that translated to 4.92 million households. And looking at the aggregate financial stress for July, you can see there that the Northern Territories went up at 35%, but all other states fell. So the net conclusion of all this is that yes, there is a bit of relief there for some households. The other factor, of course, here is that in some cases incomes have risen, partly because of the recent low wage updates, and also that some people are actually seeing wage growth quite strong at the moment, although net wages are not growing as strongly for many as inflation, and are so in real terms going backwards. Now, if we look at it by segment, and this particular chart shows you the highlighted highest segment for each category, we still see that young growing families at 90% are most exposed for those in the mortgage sector, with 286,000 in mortgage stress, 90%. Looking at rental stress, it's broadly spread across all segments, but I still notice that the multicultural establishment, the first generation migrants, have the highest level of rental stress at 85%. Investor stress is concentrated more amongst the more affluent households. So we see, for example, the young affluents and the exclusive professionals as the most exposed. And looking at the overall financial stress, well, perhaps no surprise to see that young growing families at 67% are actually the most exposed to cash flow pressure. And that's 492,000 out of the 727,000 in this category. Quickly then, we'll look at the top postcodes. So we can see here that this time around, it's Toowoomba in Queensland, Liverpool in New South Wales, Campbelltown in New South Wales, and Roxburgh Park in Victoria that are actually top of the list. And as you go down the list, you can see there a lot of stressed areas. We often see them, a lot of high growth corridors, a lot of new developments, a lot of people who've bought recently. Looking at rental stress, once again, it's Victoria, postcode 3000 at the top of the list, then Toowoomba, Liverpool, Wentworthville in New South Wales, Southport in Queensland, and Campbelltown, New South Wales. And then you can see postcodes there in Victoria, Queensland, and New South Wales down the list. And as you go down the list, you can see places like Ipswich and Bundaberg also featuring. Looking at stressed investors, interestingly, after the recent change, you can see there that Tasmanian postcode 7250 in Launceston has popped up to the top of the list. And that's because the financial pressures in the Tasmanian area is most significant for many because incomes are very pressurized. The costs of living are quite high. And for many, because the incomes are lower, the tax benefits are lower from the changes. And that also explains why we now see South Australian postcode 5118 appear in Gawler, where again, we have similar issues. Then another Tasmanian postcode 2 before we come across to New South Wales, to Narrabeen, and then Bundaberg, Toowoomba, Hornsby, Bathurst, and then up into Queensland, including South Borden, Surfers Paradise, and Paradise Point. And finally, the financial stress measures. So this is the aggregate measure. Shows this postcode 4350 in Toowoomba that has the most significant pressures, with more than 60% of households under financial pressure. Then Liverpool, then Campbelltown, then Launceston, and then a lot of high growth corridors, including Roxburgh Park, Tarneit, Dermot, and Melbourne itself in Victoria, then Ipswich, Ballarat in Victoria, Wentworthville in New South Wales, Cranbourne in Victoria, Mount Druitt in New South Wales, Bundaberg in Queensland, Pakenham in Victoria, Springfield in Queensland, and Blacktown in New South Wales. Now, we also can calculate the estimate of defaults, and this is a forward-looking measure. So I'm not looking historically at what's happened, but what is likely to happen over the next 12 months based on what I think is going to happen with regard to interest rates and cost of living pressures. And you can see there that the default rates are still relatively low, but are significantly higher than what we saw some time back, average about 2.6%. Now, if we look at it at the state level, you can see there that it's Tasmania where the highest risk of default is at 3.2%, then Queensland at 2.9%, with more than 23,000 at risk, New South Wales at 28,700 at risk at 2.8%, Victoria at 2.6% or 27,400, Western Australia at 2.8% with 18,300. And overall, you can see there that the ACT and the Northern Territories are doing somewhat better. But this means that over the next 12 months, my estimate is that we are going to see around 110,000 households risking default. And that's a little bit up from where it was previously. And by the way, if you want to know more about the whole issue of mortgage arrears and how to measure it, look at this show that I made some time ago, because the Reserve Bank came out with, well, frankly, some rather wonky information based on their securitization data. And I did pick some holes in that data and highlighted the fact that mortgage defaults were actually on their way up. And just before I close, let me just highlight that some of the particular postcodes where default is quite a lot higher than the average includes Cranbourne, that's postcode 3977 in Victoria, where around 5% of households risk default in the next 12 months. And then we've got the Western Australian postcode 6210, including Mandurah, where, of course, a lot of people bought some years ago. Prices went down and are now rising, but nevertheless, people are highly leveraged. And then another Victorian postcode, 3029, Hoppers Crossing and Tarneit. And so it goes on. And, of course, Bundaberg, Toowoomba, and also Point Cook and Derrimut in Victoria are showing there. Gosford on the Central Coast, and also places like Coomera, Samson, and Bunbury. Now, it's worth noting that Western Australian defaults are still quite high. And in fact, some of the other data coming from the ratings agencies show that the default rates are highest over in the West. Again, this is partly seasoning. It takes many years for some of these issues to come to the surface. If you want to know more about that, check back on that earlier post that I showed you just now. Now, before I close, let me just say that if you are in financial stress, it's important to get the appropriate help. And so I do recommend the National Debt Helpline, 1-800-007-007. This is, of course, is the government-backed financial counselling service. They're very busy. All the reports are that they are twice as busy as they used to be. But nevertheless, a very important source of help. Don't just Google help for financial issues, because you're going to end up paying for stuff that you don't need to pay for. So the National Debt Helpline is definitely worth reaching for. And also, AFCA's Statement of Financial Position is a really useful tool. And there, of course, you can put in things like your income, expenditure, other assets, debts, and also essentially how you can manage it. So this is quite a useful tool to take, for example, if you want to go and talk to your bank, or indeed if you want to talk to a counsellor. And one of the things I often say to people is it's important to have a view of your cash flow, money in, money out, and to understand the dynamics of your particular situation. One of the reasons why the mortgage stress analysis I do is so powerful is because it gets down into that granularity. How much money is coming in? Where are people spending? And I still see in my surveys quite often people are spending money on things which are not really that critical, whilst they're not necessarily prioritizing very effectively. So prioritization is a really good start. And then, of course, trim back. And the other point is don't just pile in more debt, because what we often see is that once people get into financial difficulty, then they grab more credit card debt or buy now, pay later, or even use the other tools like payday loans to try and get by. And all the experience that I've seen over the years is that getting more debt doesn't help. The other thing to say is that I'm still providing my one-to-one surveys. If you want an individual confidential discussion with me about a particular suburb, we can arrange to do that. I can't give specific financial advice, but I can look at my data from a particular point of view and look at the underlying trends. So we can look at the stress information, the home price trend data, and also extract a view of price trend ahead based on my modeling. And this typically is a conversation via Zoom or phone for about an hour. There is a cost involved simply because it takes me quite a lot of research to put all the information together. And because this is quite a popular service, then we're booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead, but always feel free to reach me if you'd like more information. Details are in the comments section below, or you can access it via the DFA blog and send me a message there. One other point, if you are interested in getting more specific information about the data set that I hold, you can subscribe via Patreon. In fact, we have a series of tiers on Patreon, and I want to thank those who support us via this method. It is greatly appreciated. But the particular tier where you can get the mortgage stress data now to the end of July, which is $50 a month plus GST. That's available for about 2,000 postcodes and updated each month. Now, I will be sending that information out in just over a week's time, but my plan is to run a live show Tuesday week where we'll go through the postcode analysis and mapping in more detail, and I can also answer questions live as well. So the bottom line for all this analysis is to say that yes, there was a little bit of relief thanks to the changes in the tax bands and also the government support that has come from both state and federal sources. However, the effect is not equally spread. Those in the rental sector are hardly feeling any benefit. Those in the investment sector, though, seem to be benefiting much more. And in fact, those at the more affluent end of the market are also doing quite well too. I don't think necessarily, given what we know about future interest rates and their trajectory, particularly in Australia, that this is necessarily going to be enough to get us out of the mortgage hell that we're in at the moment. And for many people, of course, the longer that it goes on, the more difficult things become. As I've said several times, what was expected to be a sprint up and then a cut in rates has now turned into a marathon. And the longer this goes on, the more households' cash flow pressures build, which takes us right back to the point that individuals should grab hold of their finances, do the work on understanding where the money is coming in and where it's going out, and then prioritize effectively, because I don't think that you can expect the government to bail everybody out. They don't have the funds to do it, nor do they have the will. They, of course, prefer to pump the economy with high migration and also to increase the tax take to try and square the books. So this is a bit of a shock for many people who discover that even after the changes in the tax bands and the other support levels, their finances are still shot. Now, if you're buying your home in Sydney's contentious market, you don't need to stand alone. This is the time you need to have Edwin Almeida from Ribbon Property Consultants standing alongside you. Buying a property is both challenging and adversarial. The vendor has a professional on their side. Emotions run high, price discovery and price transparency are hard to find, and then there's the wasted time and financial investments that you make. Edwin understands your needs, so why not engage a licensed professional to stand alongside you? With RPC, you know you have experience, knowledge, and master negotiators looking after your best interests. So shoot Ribbon an email at info@ribbonproperty.com.au, and if you use the promo code DFAWTW/Martin, you can get a 10% discount offer. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.